In this second module on the topic of regulatory monitoring, I will talk about both import and commercial monitoring. First, import monitoring. Import monitoring takes place at land and water-based border entry points, where goods cross from one country into another. In the case of the Fortification program, import monitoring applies to premix, which is often imported, and fortified flour that comes from another country. In some cases, a country will require flour-based foods such as pasta and bread to be made with fortified flour as well. If this is the case, then those imported foodstuffs might be subjected to import monitoring as well. When government officials commit to import monitoring under mandatory fortification, they are, in an actionable manner, telling the local flour millers that they believe all fortified flour should compete under the same conditions. Imported premix also needs to be monitored to verify that it contains the proper vitamins and minerals and was produced by a reputable company. Import monitoring activities are conducted by border inspectors in conjunction with customs personnel. First, let's talk about flour imports. Upon receiving a flour consignment, border control should make sure that each lot has its own certificate of analysis, COA, with the required information listed, such as lot number, date of production, expiration date, and micronutrient content. The flour should be traceable to the original producer despite the involvement of many traders in the supply chain. The labels on the pallets or boxes have not been tampered with and correspond to the certificate of analysis. The external packaging is intact, and if damage has been done, the flour sacks inside have not been torn. The flour sacks provide evidence of fortification, such as the fortification logo. If a certificate of analysis is missing, the lot should be held until one is provided and verified. If any of the other points are not satisfied, the flour should not be accepted. Sampling and testing are other considerations for imported flour. If a lot of flour arrives for a new unregistered brand, that brand is always sampled and tested. The details will be described momentarily. The sampling protocols for registered brands of flour should be determined by flour fortification stakeholders prior to the start of the flour fortification program. At a minimum, registered brands of flour should undergo sampling and quantitative testing one time per year. Now let's talk about the sampling methods for a lot of imported flour. First, 6 single samples of at least 200 grams each are collected at random from different flour sacks of the same brand. 100 grams of each are tested qualitatively at the border, usually with the iron spot test. If all the flour samples fail the test, then the lot should be rejected. If the iron spot test results vary, there are a few options. For example, let's say that in the case of one of the 6 samples failed the iron spot test. In this case, a border control inspector may take additional samples from the bag representing the failed sample or from another nearby bag. Alternatively, the inspector may take another complete set of samples. Fortification stakeholders should determine the proper protocol for dealing with mixed results prior to the start of the fortification program. If all the samples are fortified, the brand is registered and the lot of flour passes through the border to be sold in the marketplace. The remaining portions of flour are combined to make a composite sample, somewhere between 500 and 600 grams. This is sent to a designated laboratory, often affiliated with the government, for quantitative analysis of at least one marker nutrient. If the lab finds that the composite sample does not comply with the fortification standard, the border inspectors will be immediately notified. The brand will be put on a blacklist, and future consignments of that brand will receive more attention, but at the expense of the importer. The company authorized to import the brand will be notified of the lab results and the new blacklist status of that brand. The protocol for dealing with the subsequent consignments of a blacklist brand needs to be determined by each country. However, it is recommended to keep the next consignment from entering the marketplace until the result of at least one, but preferably more, composite samples are available and indicate compliance with the fortification standard. To ensure that the product does not remain in unfavorable conditions at the border for a long period of time, the sample analysis should be given top priority, again at the cost of the importer. Now we'll move on to monitoring premix imports. The processes are similar to flour. Regarding premix that is imported, upon receiving a premix consignment, border control should make sure that each lot has its own certificate of analysis with the required information listed, such as lot number, date of production, expiration date, and micronutrient content. The labels on the pallets or boxes have not been tampered with and correspond to the certificate of analysis. The external packaging is intact, and if damage has been done, the bags of premix inside have not been torn. If a COA is missing, the lot should be held until one is provided and verified. If any of the other points are not satisfied, the premix should not be accepted. When a lot of premix from an unregistered manufacturer arrives at the border, inspectors obtain and send a single sample for quantitative testing. The purpose is twofold. First, to ensure the reliability of the certificate of analysis, and second, to verify compliance with the country's premix formulation specifications, if applicable. For registered manufacturers, at least one time per year a single sample of premix is collected and sent to a lab for quantitative analysis. Unlike flour, premix does not require a composite sample. The premix has a high content of micronutrients and is expected to be homogeneous when produced by a reputable supplier. Ideally, all the micronutrients included in the premix are analyzed at the laboratory, but testing a single marker nutrient is also acceptable. If the lab finds that the composition of the premix is not adequate, the shipment is returned to the manufacturer. Now, let's move on to commercial monitoring. Commercial monitoring activities are conducted in the marketplace, at grocery stores, outdoor markets, and convenience shops, for example. It verifies that the fortified flour available to consumers complies with the specification of the fortification standard in terms of the micronutrient content, sanitation requirements, packaging, and labeling. Non-compliance at the commercial level acts as a red flag. It alerts inspectors that the internal monitoring processes at the respective flour mill might not be adequately outlined or adhered to. Though commercial monitoring can be done by any country, most fortification monitoring plans focus on internal, external, and import monitoring. The reason being it is much easier to monitor flour at a handful of flour mills and border entry points in comparison to hundreds or thousands of commercial locations. There are two cases where commercial monitoring is typically used. The first is if a country has a vibrant black market or porous borders, both of which facilitate the infiltration of unfortified flour into the marketplace. The second is if a country is conducting a national nutrition survey. Such surveys are done periodically by many countries. Engaging in commercial monitoring activities for the purpose of the survey gives an indication of whether or not the households have access to fortified flour. Due to the large number of commercial outlets in a country, developing a plan for executing commercial monitoring activities is vital. This takes time and should involve all key stakeholders. Available resources in terms of personnel and finances need to be seriously considered. In preparation, stakeholders should discuss laboratory capacity, which impacts the number of samples to be collected, annual training for inspectors, inspector time, transportation costs for inspectors, level of categorization for samples by flower type, brand or producer, costs to purchase flour at the commercial outlets, shipping costs for samples, material costs such as containers to hold the samples. For commercial monitoring, flour packages or samples are collected throughout the year in a systematic manner from the main market areas of the country. Upon entering a location to collect samples, the inspector should show his or her credentials and ideally pass along an information leaflet to the manager of the location. The inspector should then record vital information about the location, such as store name, date of visit, and town, on a data collection form. This is eventually passed along to the Food Control Authority. Now the inspector is ready to collect samples using the country's sampling guidelines as a reference. Inspectors typically obtain sealed packages of flour amounting to half to 1 kg. Each flour sack is labeled with a sample number. Next, to the corresponding sample number on the data collection form. Inspectors record the relevant information from the flour package, such as brand name, indication of fortification, lot number and expiration date. Any damage to the flour package should be noted as well. During the visit, inspectors should also scan the store to be sure that unfortified flour is not available for sale. If the inspector is suspicious of a brand, for instance, if there is no indication of fortification on the package, information about that brand should be collected and reported. Flour sold from barrels can be collected as well in similar amounts, but the inspector should assess the quality of the barrel and the label to be fairly certain that the flour is what the barrel indicates and that the storage conditions are optimal. These samples should be placed in a designated container. The packages of flour or samples and relevant data collection forms should be taken or sent to the Food Control Authority or another designated entity. At the Food Control Authority or other receiving location, the packages or samples should be split into at least two. One is sent to the laboratory and another is kept as a reference until laboratory results are obtained and deemed acceptable by all parties. At the laboratory, portions of these single samples are tested qualitatively, often for the presence of iron. Composite samples are then formed in line with the categorization set up by the sampling plan, i.e. brand or producer. Each composite sample can include flour from 3 to 5 single samples. Lastly, a lab technician conducts quantitative analyses on the composite samples. To create a composite sample of the same flour type, mix single samples of the same flour type. To create a brand-based composite sample, single samples from different packages and lots of the same brand can be mixed in equal parts. To create a producer-based composite sample, single samples from different brands of the same producer can be combined. Please note, if aggregation is done by flour type, the country will not be able to determine which producer or brand is at fault if there is a problem with the analytical results. If 80% or more of the composite samples representing a specific producer or brand are deemed non-compliant with the country's fortification standard within a set period of time, such as 6 months, notification of the findings will be provided to the relevant company. Subsequently, audit and inspection visits at the respective mills should be done more frequently for a predetermined period of time as written in the monitoring plan. If 80% or more of the composite samples representing a foreign producer or brand are found to be non-compliant, the importers will be advised and asked to inform their producers to correct the situation for subsequent consignments of flour. Border inspectors will be informed to pay close attention to those producers or brands found to be at fault. Please note that micronutrient degradation due to vitamin and mineral instability may occur between the time the flour is produced and when a sample of that flour is collected from a retail outlet and later analyzed. By the time flour and flour-based products reach the commercial level, they have been subjected to various environmental factors such as heat, humidity, and light during transportation, handling, and storage. Time alone can also play a role in micronutrient losses. Hopefully you recall the term indicators from the module about planning for a monitoring system. We will now quickly talk about a few optional regulatory monitoring indicators. Some regulatory monitoring indicators that can be tracked as part of a monitoring plan include adequate QA/QC procedures are in place at the flour mills. Flour samples from mills, import sites and retail locations adhere to the fortification standard based on quantitative tests. Imported flour batches with a certificate of analysis, and commercial locations that sell unfortified flour as indicated by flour packages without a fortification logo. For the first three, you want the percentage to rise over time. For example, the percentage of imported batches of flour with a certificate of analysis should increase. For the last indicator, you want the percentage to drop until it ultimately reaches 0. Remember, in each country, stakeholders should determine what indicators make the most sense for their program in consideration of financial and personnel resources. Now let's go over 2 examples. First, in a country there are 5 mills with the capacity to produce between 50 and 100 metric tons of wheat flour daily, and 24 mills with the capacity to produce 20 to 50 tons of wheat flour daily. Inspectors found that 26 had adequate quality assurance and quality control procedures in place. The numerator is the number of mills with adequate QA/QC procedures in place, as assessed by an inspector during a specific period of time, such as annually. In this case, that number is 26. The denominator is all mills in the fortification program that were assessed by an inspector during the same period of time. In this case, that number is 29. To calculate the indicator, simply divide 26 by 29 and multiply that by 100. The answer is 89.7% of flour mills had adequate QA/QC procedures in place. Now on to the second example. As part of regulatory monitoring activities, border control inspectors collected 48 single samples in a year from a total of 8 foreign flour producers. 8 composite samples comprised of 6 single samples each were tested for levels of iron. Quantitative lab results indicated that 5 producers adhered to the fortification standard. The numerator is the number of producers that complied with the fortification standard, in this case 5 producers. The denominator is the total number of producers that had composite samples analyzed, in this case 8 producers. The calculation is simply 5 divided by 8 multiplied by 100. The answer is 63% of foreign flour producers adhered to the fortification standard. That concludes the regulatory monitoring module. You can find forms for capturing monitoring data in the resources section for this model. Next, we will briefly cover quality management systems. When a flour mill initiates a flour fortification program, the quality assurance and quality control protocols are integrated into the mill's overall management system.